Well, thank you. Welcome everyone back. I hope you enjoyed the last sessions and the videos. They were all very, very interesting. The last session I thought was so much fun. Welcome everyone to episode 6, which is entitled Pitfalls and Promise. I want to welcome you all here. First of all, my name is Whitney Begner. I'm the Department of Energy Deputy Site Office Manager here at the Fermi Site Office. So in addition to being the deputy manager and a contracting officer, I have the role of oversight and partnering with Fermi Lab in their execution of all aspects of the communications program here at the laboratory. So when Allison and the team asked me to moderate this session, I was very quick to say yes. I have such an appreciation for the work the national labs do in communicating our science message to the broader public, including the aspects of building trust and ensuring that we comply with the highest level of ethical standards in our communications. This episode is such an interesting set of topics, and we could not have a more robust and experienced set of panelists for you here today. So just a reminder, as we go through these discussions, I encourage you to submit questions for our panelists via the chat function. If you have a question for a specific panelist, please make sure you include their name and we will direct that question towards them. So we will begin with specific discussion topics from our panelists, and then we're going to move into an open forum for questions and discussions. So first, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to briefly introduce themselves. If we could, maybe we could start with Michael.
Hello, yes, my name is Michael Dahlstrom. I'm the director of the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communication at Iowa State University, and my research focuses on storytelling about science.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Looking to see on the screen. Hold on one second. Oh, something popped up and blocked my view. I'm so sorry. Let's go to Nicole next. She's next on my list.
Hi, I'm Nicole Lee. I'm an assistant professor of communication in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Arizona State University. And my research focuses on public relations and science communication.
Thank you so much for that. And we have one more, last but not least, of course.
Hi, my name is Shupei Yuan. I am an associate professor at the Northern Illinois University. My research focuses on strategic science communication. So I mostly do how we can produce effective science communication messages and having a more strategic approach to connect with the public.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Northern is my alma mater, so I'm pleased you're here. So without further ado, let's get started on our discussions. We're going to begin with the first session that's entitled Brands with Personality and Violating Public Expectations. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Shupei.
Is my slide showing okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for the opportunity for me to talk about the research and have more conversations on this area I have been researching on quite many years. So today, like I introduced earlier, my research is about the strategic science communication. So today I invite you to think about the word strategic strategy, and I would like to share more my thoughts and findings over these years about the science communicator when you communicate, how you develop your own personality, and also seeing this from the expectations of your audience's group as well. Now, when we come to talk about like strategy and think about the personality, the first question I want to ask is, how do you describe your personality as a science communicator? You know, a lot of communication research, what we have been doing is trying to understand how we can communicate better. But when we ask the question about how we can communicate better, it's more than just the content we're sharing, the way we're talking, the media we're using. It's also about who you are. So regardless of whether you are in front of the camera or not, a lot of times you are presenting a personality, including a personality of the project. We have saw some wonderful ones earlier this morning, how you wanted to present yourself. Like someone mentioned a Bill Nye earlier in the chat box. I thought about that and quite a bit of conversation. So I also want to show this kind of little screenshot, like a little cartoon I had earlier. It reflects a video he did like a while ago on YouTube, but it got really popular about how he talked about the climate change kind of stuff. It really like suggests a strong personality, who he is as a science communicator and how he decides to talk about the climate change, this topic itself. But when we are talking about the science, and especially these days when we are talking about the science through different media channels, a lot of times our personality could be reflected into the communication style we choose. Do you choose to be a funny one? Is your project going to be very entertaining, have a lot of laughs, like many others we see earlier today? Or we have also see some example these days. It can be pretty like aggressive, it can be pretty intensive. Sometimes they really attack each other kind of thing. Is this the communication style you choose? Or some of them could be very polite, especially if we wanted to ask people to make decisions, that something in a very persuasive conversation, we might want to consider a polite conversation. And some situations that when we apply sad music, when we apply different images, we wanted to kind of use a very emotional tone to describe. But why do we choose them? So we may say, oh, being funny is always good, being polite is good, being aggressive might be bad. The job of us as like science communication scholar is to figure out if they do work, if they work certain ways, like how we wanted to know, like how we can expect kind of certain types of responses from our audiences. So one thing I wanted to highlight is that even though aggressive seems to be a little bit uncommon among all this, say what I would consider to choose, but a lot of times like the communication style communicators choose, it's not just an impression of your feeling. It could be a very strategic choice over here that try to achieve certain desired outcomes you want. So besides thinking about like, this is a very intensive topic, I feel like I needed to defend myself, defend the science, or I need to combat the misinformation. Therefore, like seems like there's a natural way of certain styles we have to use. But like a lot of times with knowing why it works or in what way it can work is a better way to consider like developing the messages as well. So these kind of like a pathway like this comes from many of years of research I've been doing with different communication styles. You can consider at the tone or a different specific message you are using to express yourself. But when it happens, it definitely works in certain ways. Like when we be funny, then the audience may think like this message is very delightful, like I like to watch it, that maybe after this I'm willing to do certain behaviors they talked about in the video. And then for some types of messages, for example, being aggressive makes me hate this person so much that I don't want to do anything he said about it, and I don't like this person either. A lot of times, like, yes, we found out they do work, but the reason behind it is more important for us to understand why they work. And the reason behind it we found is about the expectation from the audience. A lot of times when we have a conversation, the audience would have an expectation towards the communicator, how they talk. For example, in today's conversation, now you heard my introduction. I am an associate professor at NIU. So first, you know who I am. You may develop an expectation of how I should talk to you. Second, some of you may know me, some of you may not know me, knowing my personalities. Then that might also trigger different levels of expectation of how I should talk. And third, I am talking about the strategic science communication today. That's a conversation, a topic we're having, versus if I'm talking about a comedy today, that might be a different conversation. So the three things help audience to decide what kind of expectation I have for you. If it's a scientist versus like a lay person, like we may expect different ways how they talk. If it's a completely stranger versus my mom, I also expect different ways how they talk, especially if they decide to yell at me or not. Or if we're talking about a washing hand versus we're talking about the nuclear energy, that could be like still like decide on what kind of communication style that may be perceived differently. So a lot of times, every single one develops expectation from all these years of conversation, all these years like understanding of certain topics, how we see it. Then when expectation comes in and it doesn't fit, when a communication style comes in, when it doesn't fit what I expected, things could happen. If it's like, say, oh, this person is overly nice, very, very polite, that may trigger some positive expectation violation. I may see this even more positively likable than to perform certain types of behavior. If this person is so surprising, why they talk this way, this shouldn't be a funny topic, this shouldn't be so aggressive, that may trigger some negative expectancy violation, and I may respond to it differently. But it can be even a little bit more complicated with all the research we have been doing, trying to find, including whether this communicator, as your own personality understanding, a female versus the male, there might be different expectations how they talk. This person's level of expertise may influence how this is expected, and how I feel like the distance from you. If you're someone from my community versus someone who is very far away, that might also trigger different kind of expectation for your personality, your personal branding. Then also it's related to the audience, myself, how I feel about this topic previously, how my other reasoning make me decide whether I kind of like your funny style or not. And this also triggers many different things depending on what types of message you are using. Now, with not making it more complicated, let's go back a little bit. We have many, many wonderful science topics that needs to be discussed with the public. But when it comes to different science topics, are they all using different styles? Or should we set up our personality based on who we are? Or should we also consider the topic we want to discuss in order to choose the communication style? So one study we did with the executive leaders at the different scientific societies, we want to ask them, what would you think would be the most prioritized objective your field wanted to achieve? And we found they give very different answers for people for researchers who study astronomy versus the people who study chemistry, psychology. They all have their own different focuses. And when it comes to the specific topic, either related to their field, it may feel like some can be very casual. We can go very funny to talk about it. Some might be a little bit intense with all the reasons like media exposure, etc., different reasons. Some topics might not be very appropriate, or we should have a more casual way of talking if it's already very intense conversation. So the topic itself could also influence how we wanted to talk about this and how we can talk about this in order to achieve the desired effect we want. So earlier, I think Matt and I talked about how do we know it works? Or what do you think is defined as works or not? Is a question we wanted to ask ourselves, whether we are considering this achieved what I wanted to get by the end of the conversation. And that's objective. And when you have the objective, you choose your communication style, you choose a strategy that makes it as a way to go to maximize the chance that goes away as you planned it. Now, just some final words on this. So first of all, as a communicator, you have your own personal branding. Even in science communication, it requires some level of strategic planning, involves think about the objectives you wanted to achieve through today's interaction, today's conversation with the public, and then decide what kind of tactics we want to use, what certain types of communication style would help me with my objective today. And it is more than just being skillful. Another line of research I do is related to science communication training. We do see some online, you can see blogs talk about how to be a science communicator. They may show you that you wanted to use stories, use data, use pictures, or try to use some hot topics these days. But by using them, how do we choose them? And how do we present our personality as a science communicator and also to achieve the objective? It's more than just knowing the skills, but better of strategically planning them with the objective in mind. And the last one is probably the most challenging one, is to understand your audience by knowing their expectation towards you. But that also means you wanted to understand yourself better. Am I a good person? Am I a appropriate person to tell jokes? Or am I a person or more seen as a serious person with telling the science stories in a more serious way? This might be a little more challenging. It requires exercise, observation in order to get there. But as you can see, expectation is how the public perceive your message and helps for you to understand better what would be the expected response from audiences as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shupei. I really appreciate your perspective on how our communication style affects our audience's feelings. How we shape that message based on what we are communicating is so important to get our message out both to external and to internal stakeholders. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Our next discussion is a talk entitled The Interplay of Social Media, Popular Culture, and Federal Science Communications. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to focus mostly on social media and pop culture because so much of what we do in science communication applies to other areas of communication as well. So those principles really do remain the same in science communication. So a lot of what I'll talk about really mirrors some of Shupei's talk as well. So it really comes down to knowing yourself, knowing your audience, and knowing your meme. But before you can even start to consider incorporating popular culture into your social media strategy or social media content, you have to first be human. That seems pretty natural, right? But research has shown that social media users don't want to interact with this nameless, faceless organization that sounds like a robot. So there's a lot of research on conversational human voice and showing the human side behind an organization. And that also goes back to your brand personality that Shupei talked about. So it could be being more conversational, maybe being a little more casual in your discussion, actually being reactive to what other people are saying rather than having these kind of canned responses. All of those things can be very important. Another part of human presence can be having a first-person perspective. So some of the research that I've worked on with colleagues at North Carolina State has examined perspective in science videos. So whether a scientist is sharing their own research or someone else, another spokesperson, is just talking about some research findings. And what we found was that when a scientist is showing their own research, they're seen as having more expertise and people are more trusting of that message. And that really builds on some past research by Paige Brown-Jarreau and her colleagues looking at scientists who show themselves in their social media content. And there is this reaction of like, if you're posting selfies or something like that, maybe you'll be seen as less professional. But their findings showed that scientists who do include selfies or photos of themselves doing their work rather than only their work were actually seen as more warm, but it did not decrease the perceptions of expertise. So that's really the sweet spot there, is increasing that warmth, increasing that trust, while also still being seen as professional and an expert. The other important part of being seen as human is, of course, actually interacting. And this is one of my main areas of research, is dialogue and online interaction. And there is a wealth of study on dialogue and the positive impacts of interacting with your publics online. Dialogue can lead to positive relationship perceptions, and that includes things like trust and commitment and satisfaction with a relationship. And it also leads to better reputation or higher reputation perceptions. So thinking that your organization has a better reputation. And what's probably most important about these public conversations online that you may have with followers is that the effects do extend beyond those that are actively engaging in that conversation. We know that a very small portion of people that are on social media do actually engage. About 10% of people are some sort of content creators or interacting regularly. And the vast majority of us, we're lurkers. We're just observing these interactions. But what I've found in my research is that observing those interactions has very similar effects to actually participating in them. So all of those observers are forming these opinions about an organization vicariously through those interactions. So once you're a human, the next step is knowing your audience. And on social media, especially, it's easy to think like, well, we want all those Gen Zers to love us and share our content and think we're cool. But it really needs to go back again to your goal. What are you trying to accomplish with your content? And it's not simply to have a viral video. What is that viral video doing for your mission? And different platforms do have different audiences. So once you know your audience, you choose your platforms accordingly. And once you're there, keep in mind that different audiences or different platforms do have different audiences and have different norms. So the way you tap into pop culture may be different on those different platforms, because of course, pop culture references aren't universal. They're very much tied to different subcultures and demographics. And I think any professor can tell you that those things change very quickly. And what we think is funny is not necessarily what our students think is funny. And even something as recent as Breaking Bad might not be relevant to Gen Z or college age students now. So, and then of course, humor is subjective. So keep in mind who your audience is when you're using humor, using it appropriately, and testing it out. Doing informal research, and keeping track of those analytics so you can adjust as time goes on. And this again goes to brand personality, but what works for one brand does not work for all. And that's very true when it comes to pop culture. It goes back to brand voice or personality, which should demonstrate your values and goals. And having a consistent brand voice does help build credibility and positive attitudes toward your brand. And that should be based in authenticity, being true to yourself, being who your organization really is based on your goals, having what you share on social media be consistent with what you do. And that's important because perceptions of authenticity do lead to persuasion. So your messages being more effective and trust. And then to build that authenticity, because just, being true to your actions and being consistent might not be automatically conveyed. One way to do that is brand clarity. So being consistent with your brand personality, your brand voice over time, and then transparency, sharing what you can share online, whether that's budgetary or what projects are going on, employees, who's working on what, that kind of thing. Actually showing behind the scenes when you can increase perceptions of authenticity. In other words, don't force it. Don't let trying to be relevant obscure your goal. So don't try to be relevant for the sake of being relevant or for the sake of shares. It should tie back to what you're trying to accomplish, and find opportunities that do make sense for your organization. And I wanted to go through a couple of examples. I don't know if I'm the only one with a big bag of weed on their presentation today, but I'm guessing probably yes. But the TSA does a really excellent job of having a consistent brand voice, particularly on Instagram, and it is unexpected. It's a positive expectancy violation. They're not exactly what you'd expect from a stuffy government agency. And they use a lot of puns, they tap into pop culture, and they're able to do this partially because the photos they're able to take, because what people try to bring on planes is so broad. So I know this isn't really a science example, but it could certainly apply to different scientific topics. But they're able to be quirky and be like this because it is still relevant to what their goals are in teaching people, what's okay to bring on the plane or not. So I'm not going to read the whole punny caption, but I do recommend checking that out if you haven't. And then on the other end, I decided to take off which government agency this is. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus because this is not a commentary on their overall approach or anything. But this is an example of a post that wasn't particularly consistent with an organization's overall voice and brand personality. So they posted this on Cinco de Mayo and tried to make a pun about elote, and it was just kind of a stretch. It didn't really tie into what they're actually doing. And it was about creating strong passwords. So it didn't quite land. And that goes to, of course, science organizations talking about science and popular culture, or science fiction as well, tying it in. If you're going to insert yourself into that conversation and capitalize on that, of course, it's best when it does tie into what you're actually doing. So a paleontologist talking about Jurassic Park is a really clear connection there. And we saw some of those other connections that can be made in the last session that were really great and way cooler than anything I do. And then finally, know the meme. So should you post memes, to meme or not to meme? When we think of memes, we often think of these images with a text overlay, but a meme can also be how certain posts are phrased. So if you think of I was today years old when ... that would also be considered a meme. Memes can be helpful because they can create this positive affect and sharing and engagement. But if it's intended to be funny, it only works if it is actually perceived as funny. So again, knowing your audience and hopefully figuring out what they find funny. And even when you do get a lot of shares, someone thinks your joke is great and shares it, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have that organizational recall, remember who shared it or why. So again, tying in those key messages with even your humorous content. Memes can be tricky because they come with history. And I used the phrase know your meme. That's actually a website. You can look into the history of a meme. And that's important because you really need to know the formula of a meme. This is an example of that. This is a really old meme, but it's a very simple example to use. So this one is don't know a question on a test, answer is another question. So the formula is something that could be bad, but then it turns out that something good happened to kind of save it. But then people have misused the meme, and there's nothing worse than using a meme format and not understanding it. That will certainly alienate certain audiences. So know your meme, and then also think about what connotations come with certain memes if they are rooted in some sort of political ideology or something, even if it's not readily apparent in the actual text itself, knowing that history because it may have origins of a political nature. And in addition to knowing your meme, knowing the news and the hashtags that are being used. So being very careful with inserting yourself into a conversation without knowing the full context. This is a very, science examples of this. So I think you all are doing better than DiGiorno did on this day. But this is an example of DiGiorno using the hashtag why I stayed, which was about intimate partner violence, and making it something lighthearted because they did not do their research. And there's a lot of examples of hashtag misuse. So if you're going to tap into these pop culture moments, again, really doing your research and knowing what the story is behind it. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. So if you guys haven't seen, there's a lot of great comments in the chat about examples of social media accounts that are getting it right and giving fun, useful information. I found it really interesting when you spoke about the percentage of social media users that actually engage online. I did not realize the amount was that low. But I'll be really interested to probe in some of the questions about how we handle building trust with those individuals, right? Especially those ones that are heavy online contributors, especially if the trust has eroded, or even yet if we haven't established that trust yet. So it'll be interesting to think a bit more about that. So I thank you very much. The last presentation we have before we get into some of our questions is ethical storytelling. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. All right, thank you all. So we've heard from a lot of wonderful speakers today about how sharing basic research can intersect with popular culture. We've heard about tactics and outcomes surrounding movies and television, social media, connected to fields such as science communication, marketing, advertising, public relations. But across almost all of these discussions, one common denominator has been the power of storytelling. And so my goal for today is to pull back the curtain of scientific storytelling to highlight the mechanisms for how stories work and why they can be so powerful. And so I'd like to cover 3 themes today. The first one is what storytelling actually represents. What is the thing we're talking about? The second one is why storytelling can be so impactful. And then, because we know with great power comes great responsibility, thank you, Spider-Man, I will close with some ethical considerations for using the power of scientific storytelling responsibly. So first, what storytelling represents. The world is big, it is complicated and often unintuitive. So story is the complexity of the world filtered through the scale of human experience. I think a good way to illustrate this is to contrast how story and science describe the world. So for instance, here are some mountains. Science may describe how mountains are formed by the movement of tectonic plates or describe the composition of the rock, but stories describe someone's inspiration from gazing at its majesty or the struggle of climbing to the summit. Let's look at time. Science might describe unintuitive relations between space and time or describe methods of carbon dating, but stories describe how time flies when we're having fun, or that we never seem to have enough of it, or how it becomes more valuable as we realize we're running out of it. So on first glance, it seems that science and storytelling are opposites. Science seeks to uncover general truths about the world that are empirically true across contexts, whereas narratives, stories, try to illustrate a general truth through a particular case experienced at human scale. So Jerome Bruner, in his seminal work, Actual Minds, Possible Worlds, discusses these 2 contrasting modes of thought, which we're going to call scientific thinking and narrative thinking. So returning to our examples, what about science itself? How to describe science to an audience? So we could describe research questions, methods, and results, which fits right into scientific thinking. But for narrative thinking, we need to consider how could the audience experience the science? What is that link between the abstraction and the lived experience? So we can look at COVID for a timely example. Messages sharing current infection rates, hospital capacities, findings that unvaccinated people are 7 to 10-fold times more likely to be hospitalized than vaccinated people. All that falls into the scientific thinking format of sharing general truths that people could apply to their situation. But how do people experience the phenomenon? Maybe you think of your unvaccinated cousin who refused to wear a mask and never got sick, or your neighbor who lied about being a smoker so she could be among the first to be vaccinated. These cases illustrate stories of lived human experience of the larger phenomenon. And so as a communicator, considering how to strategically offer audiences these vicarious experiences through narrative can be a powerful tool. But I want to go farther and claim that scientific and narrative thinking actually represent 2 different ways of defining truth. So because the goal of scientific truth is to uncover general truths about the world that are empirically true, scientific truth is evaluated by the degree to which the information aligns with external reality. Because the goal of narrative thinking is to explore human perspectives that combine facts, emotions, normative expectations to provide interpretive meaning to reality, narrative truth is not evaluated by whether or not it's representative of the external world, but by the coherence of the connections to human experience that are built within the story. So this explains why even fictional stories, like a lot of the sci-fi and Hollywood examples we talked about, while they are untrue relative to the external world, they can still offer realistic exploration of human experience and still be considered to offer truthful insights about the world. I like this quote, which captures this difference as well. So this is Jerome Bruner. Physics must eventuate in predicting something that is testably right, however much it may speculate. Stories have no such need for testability. So there's a lot of evidence that storytelling is impactful, as audiences often change their attitudes and behaviors to align with story viewpoints. Studies in narrative bias and exemplification theory find that stories carry greater weight for decision-making as compared to scientific results. So again, returning to our COVID idea, one story of adverse side effects can counter hundreds of studies and statistics. So we've already heard a number of examples and case studies today. So I want to focus on some cognitive reasons why stories can be so powerful. And I want to offer two considerations. First, stories are more than entertaining. And in fact, some say they define our species. So Walter Fisher describes us as Homo narrans, or the storytelling human, that there's an evolutionary advantage that stories allow for making sense of the world, learning vicariously from others, and building communities of shared experiences. So whereas we invest time and resources through formal schooling to train students to think scientifically, understanding stories is universal. So storytelling is already the true native language of humanity. Psychological studies find that information formatted into stories are cognitively processed faster and more accurately than non-narrative information. And it's because there is no further translation necessary for comprehension. And so there's a test you can do just to see this in action. This is something I do with my students often. I'll tell them to get out a sheet of paper and a pencil, and I'll say, you got 20 seconds to make a bulleted list of what you did yesterday. Go. And with the time pressure on, they go real quick. And that's the only instruction. So I'm not telling them how to construct this bullet list. They could do it in any order. They could focus on anything. But at the end, when you ask them, okay, let's look at what you did, 90+% people have started making a story. I got up in the morning, I did this, I was worried about this. So when people are pressed for time and really have to think about something, we flip right into that narrative mode of thinking, and that's how we start experiencing the world. But beyond ease of process, the reason narratives are impactful goes deeper than that, which takes me to my second point. So narratives may lack the generalizability of science, but they retain more of the surrounding complexity that scientific formats often discard, such as connections to emotional meanings, motivating factors for action. And these connections lead to a richer understanding of a phenomenon. So this picture is supposed to represent schema theory. This is the idea that we build networks of concepts in our minds derived from both direct experience and mediated experience to understand and guide our engagement with the world. Areas with more experience become deeply connected and established in relation to other concepts, while other areas remain sparse islands with few connections. So for instance, I love to go hiking. So if you mention a new hiking trip based on the extensive connections in my schema built from my experience, I can quickly integrate that information to understand how long it would take me to hike the trail, what I should pack, and what other questions I should ask to make sure I have a great experience. I know next to nothing about hockey. You tell me about an outcome of a hockey game, and I would struggle to know how to place that within my mental schema. What connections would I make? Maybe I connect it to a general sports schema, or maybe to the person who told me about it because I know it's important to them. Or maybe I connect it to Canada because I think Canadians play hockey, right? Or what is often the case is I don't take the time to try and integrate it. I just forget that information because for that moment, it's not worth the work of trying to integrate it. So what we see behind many of the powerful effects of stories is that scientific formats of communication provide scientific truth that audiences need to incorporate into their own mental schema with a range of possible effectiveness, like my hockey example. Whereas stories come prepackaged with the factual, emotional, and normative components already built. It's much more convenient to accept a narrative as a package deal than allocate the mental effort to build it within your own mental schema. So I like to think it's like scientific formats of information drop off a box of IKEA furniture with instructions for how to assemble it into a dresser. But stories not only deliver the finished dresser, but they come into your house to reorganize the room and start filling the drawers with socks. In other words, scientific truth focuses more on updating the nodes within our mental schemas, whereas narrative truth focuses on strengthening or building new connections between them. And so these two reasons help explain why stories can be so impactful. Not only are they easier for people to process, but scientific storytelling offers science with pre-built connections between new concepts and lived experiences, social and emotional engagement, and the normative expectations of what is good and what is bad. So it's clear from many of the talks we've heard today that there's a lot of potential benefits for engaging in scientific storytelling. But to close, I want to offer a pair of ethical considerations that often get overlooked. The first one is there's no such thing as a neutral story. Because a story focuses on one particular case of a larger phenomenon, there's an infinite number of possible stories that could be told about any topic. The case could be told from different perspectives, focusing on different details, presented in different modalities, different lengths, connecting to different emotional reactions or normative expectations. Each story could be very different, and yet they can all be accurate. So as a communicator, you have a significant amount of power in deciding what story to tell. I said earlier that there's no such thing as a neutral story. So to put it another way, that means that all stories are intrinsically strategic and persuasive, which makes all stories potentially manipulative. All right, second, following how we discussed that scientific and narrative thinking define truth differently, this means that stories are agnostic to scientific truth. Having the most accurate scientific information does not mean you have a good story. In fact, some of the most engaging stories are the outliers, the outrageous, and often outright lies. The advantage that science has in truth-making relative to scientific thinking is of no benefit when we shift over to narrative thinking. That's why so much of the scientific misinformation that many of us are trying to counter take the form of stories. I call this the paradox of scientific storytelling. Science plays a unique role in society for providing the best available evidence for understanding the world, but it does not hold any intrinsic advantage in creating captivating stories for audiences. And instead, science must compete with other storytellers, many of whom are not bound to scientific evidence. And so this creates the paradox. How can science preserve its credibility as a curator of knowledge while engaging audiences with a communication format that can often be manipulative? And while we've already discussed why stories can be impactful, let us not forget that stories can also fail and backfire. As soon as audiences become skeptical of the motives underlying a message or start focusing on the intent of the communicator rather than the connections within the story world, the unique power of stories quickly disappears. And so there's no simple answer to these challenges. My suggestion is to be aware of the power that you hold as a communicator using scientific stories and reflect upon the decisions you make. Why do you select or create a particular story? How much is based on accuracy and representativeness versus novelty or engagement? What impact do you want to have on your audiences? Is it more about increasing interest and curiosity Or do you want to shift attitudes or behaviors in specific directions? And then what does your audience expect from the engagement? If your audience understood the strategic decisions you made, would they feel appreciated or deceived? Every act of communication is different with different goals, different audiences. So I suggest to take the time to reflect upon and be able to justify your choices as you engage in scientific storytelling. And so to close, I do want to counter the dichotomy that I set up earlier to note that even with their differences, the underlying purpose of both science and storytelling are similar. They both seek to make sense of the world and find our place within it. So I encourage everyone to go out and tell some compelling stories about science. Thank you much.
Thank you so much for that interesting discussion, Michael. I really resonated with the simply telling people about our science and hoping they get as excited as we do versus how do we really tell the story? And sometimes that's tough for us when we're talking about very complicated scientific topics. So we have quite a few questions that have come in via the chat, and we have about 13 minutes or so. So I'm going to start with one. Sometimes we have scientists that have great research, but they don't want to be the communicator of their work in traditional media. How can we get media to accept the spokesperson as acceptable substitutes? How can we build that trust with that type of an individual that isn't the scientist themselves? Does anyone have thoughts on that they'd like to share?
I could jump in. I think having some sort of experience and actually interacting with the science as much as possible, or the scientists as much as possible, is a really big part of that. Something we see a lot in science organizations is when there is such a disconnect between the people communicating the science and doing the science, that can really erode trust. And I've seen examples of it where someone asks a factual question about the research, and then the person who communicated about it might not be able to immediately answer it just because those communication channels aren't in place. So that's certainly one way. And actually still using first-person language and acknowledging your relationship with the research, even if you aren't the scientist.
I am a strong believer that the quality of communication is much more important than the quantity. So because these days with all the media technology, receiving information isn't that difficult, but receiving good quality information, be able to, like, when we have a chance of communication, this message is ready for me to understand. It's more critical. In this particular case, I would say that a scientist who is able to explain the research is important, but he or she is not the only possible credible resource to explain this as well. I think, like in this particular case, either like if there are certain types of training or resource support we can provide to scientists who may not be ready yet to communicate, or there are other ways in order to like have a more better communication at this moment than having like different types of conversation through interviews or different forms to like for the public to learn this subject.
And I would echo that very strongly. I think the quality of the communication carries so much weight. So if you think about how much science that you have learned that did not come from scientists, shows the fact that those people, those communicators are out there, and that can be the persona as well. As long as it's engaging, it's compelling, that will attract a lot of people, even if they don't even know whether or not it's a scientist.
A great point. Since we're talking about scientists, we have scientists always have their unique personalities, right? And the public, is there any research or things out there that talk about how the public views scientists? Many times, we hear that the scientists may be aggressive or arrogant or dismissive in some of the ways that they communicate with the media. And so I'm interested in whether or not there's research about that or anything you guys have seen that we could help target audience experiences a little bit differently. If there's any clear feedback in that area.
Yes, there definitely is. The research seems pretty consistent that scientists are seen as smart, having expertise certainly in their area, but the negative perceptions, or at least the less strong perceptions, they're not even necessarily negative, but they're not as positive, is in the areas of like warmth and benevolence and willingness to listen to other opinions and take into consideration other types of knowledge. So those are areas that scientists can certainly work on when they are interacting with lay publics, is actually listening and acknowledging other perspectives and trying to highlight those personality traits of being like warm and benevolent.
And I'll add, there's a really interesting figure, and I think that work is Susan Fiske, that maps warmth and competence with lots of different professions. And you can see where science lies as compared to like nurses and teachers and, military. It's really interesting to see how far science is in that you're really good at what you do, but you're not very approachable.
However, I would say with that figure, if I remember correctly, it's very high on the expertise, but a little low on the warmth. But that also form a public expectation towards scientists doing that. So if any scientist be able to tell little jokes and be nice, and that you definitely positively violate the expectation, and people may suddenly trigger more interest into your conversations. But meanwhile, we definitely have seen scientists who make bad jokes, think like they are funny, but then really what's your jokes is supposed to do? That's a bigger question to ask before you make the jokes and show that you're a funny person.
We definitely have some scientists we rely on a lot for those types of communications. They're kind of our go-to, so we can appreciate that. Switching gears a little bit, there's a Twitter discussion in the chat about the voice we use in social media. Are there any key tips for determining how to strike the right style messaging, especially when we're dealing with such diverse audiences, both internal and external stakeholders? How do we strike the right balance?
So I would say one thing about choosing the style is it really depends on what you want to get out of this message. Today, I have something I wanted to talk about. Do I want people to really clarify some information that is really a super miscommunicated so far? Then I have a very clear objective. Or today, for example, a lot of times the astronomy, when they talk about the space, it's not just about clarify certain information. It may be just about people having more interest towards this topic. In this particular case, then the style I use is to get you interested in this, not get you to really learn some knowledge in this. I think a lot of times it really depends on what you want to do in this particular activity, then go back to see what kind of style I want to choose. Even with a mixed types of audience, it's really, really hard to know who they are, what they are thinking. But I think having an effort and trying to understand who they are still today, the audience segments is kind of very much narrow. We all have the small group where we subscribe to receive information. The similar group of people can show certain types of patterns and what types of message they like to see. Just like earlier, I see in the comment section, some people say some group trying to be funny, but now we're having the question whether even being funny is a good thing or not with this particular group of audiences. Do they just prefer dry science information to actually learn something? I think that's the work we need to do as a communicator.
I'll just add, I really liked Rick Borchildt's response to that question as well, is that you can have a consistent voice that's true to yourself while having different content for different audiences. And I kind of think of it as how you interact with people at work. So you might speak a little differently to your assistant and colleagues or students or whatever different groups, just because those interactions might have different purposes and you have a different relationship with those people. But if someone from the other group overheard you, they shouldn't be who is that? So just being that type of consistent, even though it does change based on your goals, like Shupei said, and who you're interacting with a little bit.
Thank you very much. That's awesome. I think, let's see, we have a few minutes, so let's see if we can fit in another question. This one I thought was really interesting. Some of the best science communication isn't about the science at all, at least not in terms of framing, but rather the stories and the personalities. If true, have you found in your research that scientists are resistant to that message? What have you found effective for working with scientists and professional communicators to shift from telling the facts to telling a clear, compelling story that exhibits your humanness?
So I would say yes. I didn't mention that because I figured this audience today is already on board, but yes, I've run into a lot of scientists with that idea. And I think a lot of it's because the scientific knowledge is important. It's hard won. It takes a lot of work to get that. And it's hard to say, even though that's the best information, it might not be what people want. And so having to make that change can be almost an insult to say, this work is good, it should be enough. And saying it's not can be an insult. I have one example, but I want to let the other panelists answer that as well.
I think that's exactly right. The only thing I would add is it does just go back to that tie to the deficit model and this perception that well, I want to just explain the information better so they know it. And that's not the goal. We know that giving people more information in itself does not change attitudes and behaviors.
Yeah, and we have done some research with those training programs too. They start to recognize just telling science clearly isn't enough either. So one approach I've seen some training workshops have been doing is really try to highlight the benefit or the risk, because for the public, especially in an informal setting, if it's not relevant to me, nothing risky or benefit for me, why do I care? It's initially it's not going to attract to me. So that type of training program, they really try to highlight the relevance between your scientific knowledge and the public. So when the connection is built up and embedded in your message, it's more likely to attract the public to get engaged into the conversation. So that's definitely one approach to address the issue of I'm telling my story clearly. How could you not listen or not get it?
Michael, you had an example?
Yes, just to bring it back to popular culture, I think the My Octopus Teacher is a very good example of this. So this is a documentary where someone talks about going down and just observing an octopus for, I think, a couple years maybe, and it helps them with mental health. It's a very well told story, and it got a lot of attention. But there were scientists who said, well, I'm going to critique that because that's not really how the octopus thinks. The author was putting his expectations onto what the octopus was wanting. And it was this disconnect of where's the accuracy that is most important? Is the fact that people are now getting a sense of wonder about the ocean, want to protect the octopus, the fact that, probably the documentarian did put his own views onto it, but is that enough to push back? So that, I think, just that little conflict around that documentary raises that issue very clearly.
Yeah, that's a great example. Well, we are about at our time here. So I want to take a moment and thank everyone in the chat and on the event as a whole for their participation and the great questions. I also want to specifically thank our panel members, Michael, Shupei, and Nicole. This has been really insightful and interesting and definitely gives us something to think about as we're communicating with our internal stakeholders, as well as the public, communicating both science and non-scientific messaging, right? How do we build that trust and how do we set the right tone? So up next, we have a brief commercial break. So everyone gets a chance to get up, move around, and then tune back in. We will get started in roughly 10 minutes or so. So thank you, everyone.